Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Really happy to bring this topic. It's such a timely moment for Alberta. And so today's topic on lobbying is just part of our legal series where we bring light to topics in legal compliance for nonprofits in an interactive and hopefully straightforward way. And my name is Liz Tang. I use the pronoun she, her, and I'm the education coordinator for Integral.org. I'll be assisting Yvonne in hosting this webinar and monitoring the chat. But without further ado, it is really important that we acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples presently subjects to Treaty 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation, and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. And we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First People of Canada who have lived in and shared these lands for a generation. We are so grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today, as well as those who have gone before us. So today's facilitators and moderator, first we have Yvonne Chenier. She's a lawyer and philanthropy consultant and co-founder of Integral.org. Sorry, I'm just going to pin her for, there we go. And she's also the co-founder of Integral.org. Yvonne brings more than 35 years of experience to those in the philanthropic, nonprofit, and social enterprise sectors. As a general legal counsel and as an advisor on organizational, regulatory, and governance matters. She's also an active member of the executive of the Charities and Nonprofit section of the Canadian Bar Association and is past chair of both the Alberta and national sections. She's named in the Canadian Legal Lexicon Dictionary for excellence in charity law and has been selected by her peers for inclusion in the best lawyers in Canada for her work in charities and nonprofit law. We're also really excited to be joined by Aileen Burke. She is Alberta Council's nonprofit lead. She's an experienced lobbyist, researcher, facilitator, and communicator. Aileen has more than 15 years of frontline and management experience in the nonprofit sector, combined with years of experience of being involved with various boards and community groups. Aileen pursued her master's degree in political science from the University of Lethbridge, where her work focused on public policy and systems integration as it relates to the Housing First philosophy. Aileen has put her expertise in political advocacy into action with a run for office at the municipal, provincial, and federal level. So thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed today's webinar.
Thanks, Liz, and welcome everyone. This is a very important topic that we're covering in our legal series at Integral.org, and the overview of what we're doing in the next hour is basically to talk about lobbying. What is lobbying? We'll talk a little bit about the Alberta Lobbyist Act. We're focusing on our efforts today on the legislation and the environment in Alberta because of our time constraints. We'll highlight our lobbying toolkit that we have created at Integral.org. And for all of you who are wondering, we're going to say, why should you lobby? How can your organization lobby? Then for the registered charities in the room, we're going to talk about the PPDA, the new kid on the block under the Income Tax Act when we're talking about registered charities doing any advocacy work. And the most important wrap up, I think, is the practical tactics we're going to learn from Aileen for effective engagement in this area. So without further ado, let me ask Aileen, what is lobbying?
Perfect. Thank you all for joining us today. So, I mean, lobbying, it comes across as a pretty scary word. There was a joke in our office that kind of equates lobbyists to the same level of used car salesmen, right? Like they come across as sleazy or, you know, it's sketchy. But really, when it comes down to it in Alberta, lobbying is simply advocating. It's what you're doing every day. You're attempting to influence a decision. So your efforts to influence these decisions are usually directed at elected officials or, you know, government administrative folks, those people in government who are impacting the work that you do on the daily. Just a random fun fact, Lobbying was coined in the 18th century when English MPs would attempt to influence each other during conversations in the lobby of Parliament. So it's really just about having those grassroots conversations with anybody and everybody to try and impact change on a systems level. This just kind of gives you a bit more of a definition, a formal definition, but it's generally defined by many statutes across Canada, communication with a public office holder in an attempt to influence legislative process, including the awarding of any grant, contribution, or financial benefits. So it's a really wordy way to say, like, you're just literally trying to influence government policy. When you're communicating, the problem where some of the confusion comes from is that you can communicate with a public office holder, but you're also, this expands outside of just elected officials, right? So this is talking about constituency staff, this is talking about ministerial staff, this is talking when you're advocating to the general public too, right? If you're using this on social media and even tagging any local politicians or anything of that nature, that's considered advocating, that's considered lobbying, and people don't realize that you've probably been involved in some form of lobbying for a long time, and we say that through grassroots communication. So this is just kind of acronym language just to make sure everybody's on the same page. So public office holder, POH, it's basically any elected member of government. So whether this is federal, provincial, or municipal. It's a member of the public holder staff, an employee, officer, director, member of any department. So this is the administrative folks that I was just speaking to you about, the bureaucracy, and then any individual appointed to any board, committee, or council by the public office holder. So anything that's tangentially at all connected to an elected official would be included in your advocacy efforts. So a really wordy slide that you can find online. So don't feel like you have to frantically write this all down or anything of that nature. Alberta, the website has a really handy kind of breakdown for you that is a one-pager, but this just kind of shows you what counts as a lobbying activity. So things like the development of a legislative proposal. So if you're trying to influence actual legislation, that would fall under lobbying. If you're trying to introduce a bill or an amendment, lobbying. I'm not going to read this all to you because you all know how to read, but even, for instance, receiving grant funding, because it's if it's provincial or government grant funding, right, that's considered a lobbying activity. And so these are things that you kind of do on the day-to-day that you don't even think about, right? It's just part of your operations, but you're already doing this work. And so this is just the point of this kind of webinar is to help highlight the fact that you're doing this already, to try and remove some of that fear and stigma around the activity itself, and to provide you some tangible tools to expand on the efforts that you're already doing in your day-to-day.
So who does lobbying legislation apply to? And at Integral Org, where our job is to help organizations understand the regulatory environment they live in, amongst other things, we realize that organizations in Alberta are trying to impact various levels of government or public office holders in various jurisdictions, including Canada, which is a separate jurisdiction from Alberta as far as lobbying legislation is concerned. And we did a project across Canada to look at the different legislation. And we realized that even though we knew that the jurisdiction that you had to look at depends on where you're lobbying, not necessarily where your organization is, we realized that the legislation was different in each jurisdiction. So even though some things are common, there are some really interesting nuances of failing to comply with the lobbying legislation, or different kinds of criteria that apply to you to determine if your organization is in fact lobbying or not. But generally, there are consequences of not registering under the Lobbyist Act if you have to under most jurisdictions, and they include fines, sometimes imprisonment, and sometimes the prohibition from lobbying. But in Alberta, which is where we are here today, we have quite an interesting situation. The Lobbyist Act that we are complying with in Alberta, if we're lobbying public office holders from Alberta, the Lobbyist Act does include charities and nonprofit organizations in its definition. However, it has an interesting exemption. The Act itself does not apply to directors, officers, or employees of a nonprofit organization that do not serve employer, union, or professional interests, so mostly the union or the labor kind of organizations. And the most interesting exemption is, or have a majority of members from profit-seeking enterprises when acting in their official capacity. And then clearly it says the Act does not apply to volunteers who do not receive a payment. So those would be, volunteers in your organization. But the interesting part about the have a majority of members from profit-seeking enterprises when acting in their official capacity would mean those organizations that have as members of their organization business corporations. Those would be profit-seeking enterprises. So sometimes when we are looking at organizations that say, should we register under the Lobbyist Act? Do we need to comply with this act? One of the first things we look at if they're a nonprofit organization is, who are your members? Are you serving employer, union, or professional interests? Then clearly you're caught under the Act, you're not exempted. But if you have corporations, mostly profit-seeking corporations, as your members, again, you may not be exempted under the Act. So those are important things to look at. Who are the members of your organization? Because that will help you as nonprofit organizations determine if you have to comply with the Lobbyist Act in the form of meeting the registration threshold, which is indicated here, and what Aileen will talk a little bit more about. So that's important. However, we do have some help for you. Aside from the fact that Alberta does have a really good definition of grassroots lobbying right in their legislation, it's very clear that if you are not exempt from the Act and you are embarking on what you consider grassroots lobbying, it wouldn't include if you're communicating amongst your members, your officers or your employees, your internal communications, for example, or if you are a partnership or a person includes a corporation, and communicating with your shareholders, partners, officers, or employees. So internal stuff is not considered grassroots communication. That's, when we're looking external to our organization. However, keep this in mind. You may or may not have to register under the Act in Alberta if you're dealing with public office holders in Alberta. But we have a toolkit. Liz, how can you tell us about the toolkit? What's available?
Yeah, so we have our lobbying toolkit. This it's a toolkit that contains both a video that covers basic information about lobbying and lobbying legislation, and then it also has a series of documents that easily summarize the relevant legislation for each jurisdiction in Canada. So, mentioned today, we're keeping the focus on the Alberta lobbying context, and you can find further details on the Alberta legislation. And then it also has documents for other provinces, territories, and the federal context as well. So if you have questions related to when you might need to register or how to track hours, we have a really straightforward guidance in this toolkit. I'll put a link in the chat and you can access this for free. You don't have to sign up for anything. It's completely open access, and it's just part of our mission at Integral.org to help other nonprofits like you to best fulfill your missions. So
thanks, Liz. We're very proud of our toolkits. And any information or ideas you have about toolkits we should do, please let us know. So let's say you were going to be lobbying. You look at the toolkit, you figure out where you're lobbying, what you can do. Why would you engage in lobbying? What's in it for you? So Aileen, what's in it for organizations who want to lobby?
Yeah, I mean, the potential here is endless. For why you should be at the table, right? Government doesn't know what they don't know, and nonprofits are historically and noticeably missing from the tables in government, right? We're not often invited to the tables, we're often overlooked, we're kind of the scapegoat, right? And so if you're not lobbying, if you're not talking to government, your voices are being missed. And I recognize that this is easier said than done, and that even if you are trying to scream into the void, it feels like at times it's still important that we continue to scream. And so the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? If you want to be heard and you want to cut through the noise, then you need to find a way to sell what you're trying to change, right? And so you need to make sure that your messaging is clear, but that you're able to raise enough noise and cut and get enough support behind you that you're able to get ahead of the rest of the people who are also screaming into the void. But if you're not having those conversations, then nobody is going to know what you do or the value of what you do. And therefore, when they make those policy or funding decisions or what have you, they're not taking into consideration the impact that it's going to have on your existence because they don't understand. So this is just, I mean, I probably don't need to talk to you about why advocacy matters. There's a reason why you're in the job you're doing, right? A lot of us work in nonprofit work because we're passionate about, working with people and raising everybody up and kind of that equity framework of things. But advocacy still matters, especially in the lobbying context, because we all know that governments, elected officials are pulled in a million different directions, right? Everybody's looking for their attention. Everybody wants to have a minute of their time. Everybody's asking for something. If you are an effective advocate, then you're going to be able to cut through that noise and you're able to have those long-term sustainable changes that we're looking for. And so if you're looking at a broad picture, the long-term advocacy makes sure that you're building on those relationships and you're building that trust and that rapport and that understanding, so that way the decision makers in government have a better understanding of who you are, what you do, and how their decisions impact what your operations are. Without those long-term relationships, and this kind of goes both ways, especially in a government that is particularly volatile at times, as we've seen in the last few years, right? You lose those long-term relationships and then you lose that legacy knowledge. And so you're constantly rebuilding these relationships, but those relationships are what matter. So it's like it says here, it's more of an art than a science, right? It's really about your people skills, and you're all really good at people. That's what you do for your day-to-day, right? So make sure you're knowing your audience and aligning your messaging with what the government is doing, and kind of what buzzwords they're using at the time. It's an unfair onus on you folks, so like fully acknowledging that right off the hop, it puts a lot of burden on the stakeholder themselves, but that's just kind of our unfortunate reality. So starting into some of those practical tips for you. The first thing you really, really need to do before you start talking to anybody, frankly, is that you have to have a clear definition of what your advocacy objectives are. So, make sure that you're realistic, that your list is narrow. If you go in with a list of 12 different asks, you've essentially asked for nothing. We usually recommend that you go to a meeting with an elected official with 1 or 2 asks. You make it as simple as possible, so that way they can't cherry pick what's going to be most convenient for them. And so keep the list small and concise, know what the cost is of what you're asking, and be able to explain to the government what the return on investment is going to be. Why should they give you that money? What good is it going to do? How does it help them do their job, right? We shouldn't have to do that work, but if we are able to clearly lay out a path and make it as simple as possible for them to be like, oh, yeah, we have no other questions, whatever, then they're more likely to say yes because it's less work for them, right? And so however we make this as simple as possible for them, and be super specific, because you don't want to give them too much wiggle room, or else you're going to wind up roped into an agreement that you want nothing to do with, or that's scope creep, or any of those kind of things that you folks have to deal with on the daily. But most importantly too is to make sure that whoever is advocating on behalf of your organization, whether that's your board, whether that's your membership, whether that's just supporters in general, etc., that everybody is in agreement with the advocacy objectives you've identified, and that everybody has the same key messages. Because if you're all going out saying 12 different things, then you might as well have just gone to that meeting with 12 items on your advocacy list, right? And so you have to make sure that you're internally aligned as well. So we touched on this already, but relationships are really the end all be all here, which is why we suggest, trying to start building those relationships in the context of this conversation, before the election and during the election period, because folks who are running now are hungry for information and are eager to meet with people. Once they're elected, I know they're busy during campaign, but it's a different type of busy, right? And if you've taken the time and effort to start building those relationships during the campaign period itself, when those newly elected folks are trying to onboard and learn their portfolios and what have you, they can point to you as the knowledge expert and be like, oh, I met this person during the election. I should follow up with them and ask them questions because they know X, Y, Z about this part of my portfolio, right? And so you're starting to build that rapport right off the hop that you are the knowledge keeper, and that they can turn to you as a trusted advisor. And that starts that process, right? Keep in contact. It's like maintaining your friendships, right? Like in your day-to-day life. Frequent small interactions. Make sure you're sending thank you notes where applicable. Just a drop in a random coffee at some points, just to, make sure that you're keeping those touch points so that they don't forget who you are, right? Like, be in their faces. This is the squeaky wheel thing, right? Be there. Make sure they know that they can't forget you. Anytime they see you, they're like, they should just immediately be like, oh yeah, I know what your ask is. You don't even have to start, right? Like, they should know that. Have your elevator pitch ready. It needs to be 30 seconds. So that way, if you run into people, you can hammer it out, right? Unfortunately, some relationships can't be made without the right introduction. So leverage your relationships with other people, leverage your relationships with other folks in government, leverage your relationships with other stakeholders, partner groups that you work with, and see if you can get invited to that table. As we've seen with this government, particularly, especially with the volatility and the changes in staff and the reorg of the structure of the ministries themselves, right? This goes to some of that legacy piece. You might have to start over again, and that's annoying and frustrating and time consuming that nobody has time for that kind of stuff. But we have to make the time. And this is where nonprofits are in a unique position, because your priorities kind of have to be split. Like, you're so focused on serving the community that you serve, that you work with. But if advocacy and lobbying and systemic change and that kind of thing is part of your mandate or part of your goals as an association, then you have to prioritize talking to government too. And so that kind of splits you in an unfair way. But when those changes happen in government, that doesn't mean that relationship is a waste, right? It means now you have an internal advocate, and they can start pulling lobbying on your behalf inside government. And so make sure that you're maintaining those relationships with the former ministers or former councillors or what have you, because they're usually still involved and influential. So make sure that you're trying to keep those touch points. This doesn't have to be often. I'm not saying go out and do this every single month, because that would be ridiculous, but like, make sure that you're consciously putting effort into these kind of activities. Lots and lots and lots and lots of different ways that you can engage with folks. This is kind of a general overview of what you can do during and in between election periods. So like, this is, meeting with your elected officials and their political staff to have coffee, to have, or just to swing by and drop off a dozen donuts and say, hey, just stopping in, and then you leave again, right? Like, just so you're a constant presence. engage with their friends. This is where you're finding those internal advocates. This is where you're finding those cross-ministerial intersections. This is where you're building those relationships with backbenchers who might be able to influence things internally and pull on your behalf too. Attend events and maintain a visible presence. Obviously, capacity is a thing, but like where possible, try to attend events, community events. In the election season, attend candidate breakfasts, attend forums, those are the types of events that you're kind of looking for to try and make sure that you're getting that face time in a more relaxed, informal manner, right? Because that's how you kind of build those relationships too. So look out for opportunities for mix and mingles and networking events too, because those are really good opportunities to make those initial touch points. The next point is maybe a little more controversial. Communicate positively about government policy where possible. I put this here with a giant caveat of I'm not suggesting that you go out and praise anything and everything the government is doing. And you have to be super careful on how you do this too, because you can't come out and support a party, but you can support government action, right? And so a lot of the time the government doesn't get it right where the nonprofit sector is concerned, but there's usually snippets of things that are okay, that they didn't completely botch, right? And so if there's ways that you can communicate those, like you're in support of this and you look forward to having further conversation to address XYZ issues, and it's like that compliment sandwich, right? So where possible, give kudos where kudos are due, props where props are due. They get a lot of flack. Being an elected official is a lot of hard work, and they're yelled at a whole lot. So saying thank you goes a really, really long way to building those relationships. And then the last point, just about communicate with a coordinated message, like this, we talked about that already a little bit, but like I cannot emphasize this enough. If your message is fragmented and different at every single meeting or every single person advocating on your behalf, your message is lost. Nobody will understand, it will be confusing, and your ask will get lost. So make sure that your elevator pitch is the same everywhere and that it's on repeat. You're just saying that until you accomplish what you do or until you change your advocacy goal. Some more ideas for what you can do. It really depends on what you're kind of advocating for. You can do phone calls. Phone calls is effective, especially right now where we've moved to a digital era and everybody sends emails. So phone calls can be effective at annoying the hell out of elected people. So if you're really trying to raise public awareness and you're really, really doing a big push, phone calls are time intensive, so it takes more capacity, but that's the squeaky wheel. Not a lot of people do phone call campaigns anymore, right? Social media, this is huge. This is starting to grow consistently, continuing to grow consistently. And I'm sure we've all seen this growth, Facebook, Twitter, even LinkedIn is getting big, Instagram, and so make sure you're using whatever channels you have the biggest reach on. Half the time now, engaging with the public or politicians is less about off the hop. It's less about what information you're trying to share and more about getting people to click on it, right? Like, how do you engage people right off the hop in a one sentence headline, right? And so make sure you're cognizant of that. Attend or host events. There's lots of ways during an election, for instance, there's lots of ways you can get involved. There's the forums and the breakfast, but like you can also host your own thing or look for partnerships to host your own events. We saw in Calgary just this week, right? The nonprofit town hall with the nonprofit vote and Rachel Notley. Those are the types of events that you can work in partnership with other organizations, so that way you've got the broad reach, spread the workload, but still be able to meet those influential folks. And then it's the standard in-person meetings where you're having those sit-down conversations with people in public office. when going to meetings, this is all about, communication and making sure that you're all on the same page and that your advocacy messages and key messages are on point. So prepare briefing materials. We always recommend that when you're meeting with a public office holder, that you have a one-page document. This can be one page front and back. If you're sending it digital, it doesn't matter. So it's like 2 pages, but make sure that you're sending it in advance of the meeting. These briefing materials are usually really high level, like 0.4, make it super, takes them 3 minutes to read kind of deal, because that's all they're going to do. If you have fun ways to put graphics and stats in there, like make it pretty, make it eye-catching, and you're more likely to get the attention of the minister. Make sure that your key messages are in alignment with the messaging that the government is using. Find what is in their mandate letters, find what their buzzwords are, find what they're passionate about, what are they pushing right now, and try to find alignment with those kinds of messages. Not saying change what your advocacy goal is, but there are usually ways, and sometimes you have to be creative, but you're all very creative folks, to find where those points of connection are, and then make sure that you're not surprising the government. So like make sure that what you're speaking to on the briefing note is all you speak to, that you don't bring up anything else unless the minister asks. And sometimes that happens, but stick to what your briefing materials say and don't bring uninvited guests, because that will cause tension right off the hop. If you're asked to provide follow-up information following a meeting, do so as soon as possible, because again, they're being talked to all the time. Any kind of request like that, if you don't follow up, it'll be forgotten, it'll be lost, and then you have to start over again. And we've seen this happen lots of times, and it's a shame, right? It's just a lost opportunity. And so make sure you're sending thank yous afterward. Thanks for your time. Here to address any questions should you have anything, follow up the meeting, that kind of thing. And then make sure that you're leaving room for questions, like we'll do at the end of this, right? The public office holders don't know what you know, and you live and breathe this stuff, right? And so make sure, when also, it's a good point actually, now that I think about it, you live and breathe this stuff, make sure that you're using plain language. Pretend these people know nothing about anything, because frankly they probably don't when it comes to the work you do. So like, keep it simple. We say grade 5 reading level. If you can keep it to that, you're going to probably break through. Timing and challenges. Well, I think we are all very familiar with this, but when you're building your kind of lobby strategy or advocacy strategy, just make sure that these are some of the things that you're considering when you're building any kind of campaign. So when is the legislative session? When are they sitting? When are constituency breaks? When, those types of situations. Where are we at in the budget cycle? Where are we at in the election cycle? Because that'll impact how likely they are to entertain a specific ask. Are we currently in a nomination period, or is there is there a leadership race? How complex or how big of an ask are you asking for? Who knows about your issue? Is there big public support? Do you have evidence to support why you're asking for this already? Do you have a coalition backing you in this, right? Is there public support? Because if support already exists, then you can rally, right? There are troops to rally if need be, and government knows that. And so these are things that you have to be really cognizant of when you're building your strategy, just to ensure that you're able to mitigate for as much risk as possible. All right, so timing and challenges. Yeah, I mean, they're pretty straightforward, but to go back to keeping your ask and making sure that everybody's on the same page, if your ask is not clearly communicated, unidentifiable, or undifferentiated, it will go nowhere, because government will be confused and they don't have time to, or the care, frankly, to try to sift through it. They don't want to have to interpret what you're trying to tell them. Be as point blank as possible. Make sure that you have a business case. Demonstrate the need. We heard just this month, I don't know, April 4th, when we had the panelist discussion with Minister Nixon and Minister Luan, they both commented at the lack of nonprofit ability. Now, there's lots of issues with the statement that they made, but they made the statement that nonprofits don't do a good job at demonstrating the business case. That's not always easy for us to do. We work with humans. Humans aren't always, like, it's not numbers. It doesn't come down to numbers, right? But we have to find a way to communicate our story with those numbers so we can demonstrate a business case. Make sure that your ask is reasonable. If you go in on a first meeting and you're asking for $32 million, you're going to be laughed right out the door, right? You have to take into consideration what current partnerships you have with the government, what kind of funding you already have with the government, so you can kind of leverage those relationships already and base your ask kind of on your context. Sometimes easier said than done, but just make sure that you're being really realistic. And when you're thinking of realism too, think about the cost of oil. You know, where are we at in the budget? Are we at a surplus? Are we at a deficit? Or, you know, like what's the ideology of our current governing party, right? And those are kind of things that you have to take into consideration as well when you're thinking about realism. Be willing to acknowledge that there might be conflicts, right, with other priorities, whether that's within government themselves or with other stakeholders that you might share space with, right? Sometimes what you want directly conflicts with what nonprofit Z wants, right? And be willing to acknowledge that, because they're going to call you out on it anyhow. So acknowledge that and address why it's still important that they support that. And if you don't, then they're going to think you're trying to hide something. So just be really, really honest, open and transparent. I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking. Yvonne, is there anything you can add? Sorry.
Well, I just quickly go over what the advocate's role is, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, just in case the advocate might be inside a charity.
In the context of this presentation, I want to clarify that the advocate is widely, broadly defined. So the advocate could be you, it could be any board member, it could be if you engage a consultant or a lobby firm, it could be that person, it could be your communications person, right? Like this could literally be anybody you identify as an advocate on your behalf. It's just super important that whoever is advocating is keeping up to date on what's going on politically. Context matters, and political context changes day to day, especially during an election. They will often assist in preparing communication materials, briefing materials, right? So make sure that whatever is being prepared for communication materials aligns with your internal communications policy too, and your internal messaging, just so there's that consistency. Connect with your key decision makers and strategic partners. So making sure that you're communicating with anybody and everybody, right? This is the open and transparency thing. Communicate with both sides of government, opposition and governing party, so that way everybody is kept in the loop and you're maintaining those relationships on both sides of the aisle. The person will also help you narrow in your priorities and your advocacy strategies. And so this is how you kind of define what you want to ask for and the key messages behind it. And then in the case back channeling, a lot of this is more related to a lobby firm because we have those connections internally. But sometimes we have a lot of, you know, all of you folks have boards and people who are differently connected to different groups and stakeholders, right? Find those relationships and leverage them. Maybe they have those contacts internally and they're able to find out some debrief information or some briefing information for you that you can use to prepare for the meeting or for next steps.
Good, thank you. Well, if that advocate happens to be inside a charity, then they should know that there are special rules for charities. So, you know, all you nonprofit organizations that are not registered charities, you know, basically the world is your oyster. Lobby. And you already know whether to check to see if you have to register under any lobbyist act to do so. But if you're a charity, it's the Income Tax Act really that governs your special status as a registered charity. And you know, this is basic charity 101. Every charity has to be constituted and operated exclusively for charitable purposes. And all the resources of the charity have to be devoted to charitable activities carried on by the charity. So until a few years ago, that sort of excluded any kind of activities that we're talking about today if they were more than 10% of your activities. There were special rules, and they've been changed because now we have a new word. It's a big word. It's public policy dialogue and development activities, or PPDDA, that further a charitable purpose. And you can do those kind of activities. And the key though is that the charities PPDAs have to be carried on in furtherance of the stated charitable purpose, of your charitable purpose, of your registered charity. If that's the case, then the world is your oyster. There's no limit to the amount of PPDAs a charity can engage in, as long as it's further in furtherance of its charitable purposes. And before I talk about PPDAs, some of you who may have been to our other seminars, you know where you get your charitable purposes. They're in your incorporating or amending documents that CRA used when they gave you charitable status. Very important for this particular context. So in December 13th, 2018, the Income Tax Act was changed in consequence of cases that were going through the courts at the time. But it was changed to allow charities to carry on these PPDAs in furtherance of their charitable purposes. So they are basically activities a charity carries on to participate in the public policy development process or facilitate the public's participation in that process. The latter would be the grassroots communication, and the former would be the actual charities lobbying activities or influencing activities. All of this was in this budget in 2018, which was well needed. The next slide basically talks a little bit about the Canada Revenue Agency's interpretation of the new rules, and they issued a guidance for public consultation outlining the new rules. We all commented on it. A revised guidance, the final guidance was issued in 2020. And the result basically is that CRA, who is the regulator of all things charity, has now confirmed that the Income Tax Act deems PPDAs that are carried on in support of the charitable purpose to be carried on in furtherance of those purposes and not for any non-charitable purpose, such as a political purpose. So PPDAs are not political, as long as they're properly done as PPDAs. And there's a few examples on the next slide about what CRA does consider a PPDA to be. So providing information, research, disseminating opinion, advocacy, which is really what we're talking about today, mobilizing others, that's your grassroots mobilization, representations to government on your issue that relate to your charitable purpose, of course, remember that in the background, providing forums and convening discussions such as Aileen was discussing and communicating on social media. So if you're a charity, go for it if this suits your charitable purposes. The big thing though, and what will lead into our final discussion about the political side of all this, is of course, PPDAs have prohibited actions, and they're all about specific direct or indirect support of political parties or candidates for political office. So these are the partisan activities. So a charity cannot do PPDAs that are partisan in nature. And this is very clear, and the bulletin goes into that. So they've given you some examples here, you know, endorsing a candidate over social media, actually making a donation to a candidate's campaign, or, you know, allowing a political party to freely come in and use your premises. And then there's the softer sort of the indirect support. When you have, you know, evidence out there that it appears that your charity supports a certain party through its PPDAs, that sometimes, you know, could invite scrutiny by CRA. And of course, the big one, you know, you can't send your staff out to support a political campaign just because they're on your side. So these are indirect things, and then there's direct things. But you better be careful that you're not doing any of these things if they're partisan, and if you're a registered charity, because you could be jeopardizing your charitable status. So having said that, tell me about third-party advertising. That's the other thing we need to know about it when we approach elections.
Yeah, so third-party advertising in Alberta is a relatively new thing. It's been revamped recently, and so there are 6 types of TPAs. I'm not going to go into them all because for the purposes of this discussion, you really just need to know about the election stuff. So the definition there is just engages in election advertising to promote or oppose or take a position on an issue associated with a registered party, a candidate, or an MLA. Now, this is super, super broad, and I recognize that a position or an issue, well, this election is all about affordability and public safety and healthcare and, you know, education, all the things the social service, the social civil society operates and exists in, right? So you have to tread very carefully here because almost any issue could be considered an election issue, right? This year, election issue will include childcare. It will include our sexual assault centers. It will include food insecurity. So like if you're engaging in any of those levels, consider it an election issue, right? And so what's really important to know here is you only have to worry about crossing this threshold if you spend or plan to spend more than $1,000 in advertising. So we just say, don't do it. Don't cross that threshold if you don't have to. It can get messy. If you are going to do it, you have to make sure that you're carefully weighing the pros and cons because there is definitely risk involved. We know, I mean, we all know third-party advertisers exist, right? ATA is a good example of that. But they're giant. They're a big organization. They're very vocal and they're in the media a lot against the government, right? And if you're going to take that route, you have to have the capacity and the fortitude to continue that fight for a while. And that can be exhausting and there's obviously risk involved, right? So just be careful, try, but avoid it if you can. It's the easiest way.
Thank you. Yeah, especially if you're a nonprofit organization and certainly if you're a registered charity. So we've got about 10 minutes left or less and don't see any questions coming in the chat, but please put in your questions. But while we're waiting, I'll be monitoring the questions. Tell us a little bit, Aileen, about how a nonprofit organization or a charity can prepare for the next Alberta election.
So, I mean, we're kind of past the pre-election stage. Writ will be dropped on Monday. So electioneering officially begins. I mean, it's been going on for a while now, but officially begins on Monday. The election is being held on May 29th. So advance vote will start right before then. But typically what we say, you know, for your pre-election type work, you know, make sure that you know what you want to advocate on. What are your election issues? What do you have materials ready to go to? Is your membership on board? Do you need to change any of your messaging? Do you need to change any of your advocacy priorities? Are you going down the third-party advertising route, right? So just make sure that you have an idea of how you're going to engage in the election. I'm just flying through the pre-election stuff because we're past it, but like there's lots of different ways to engage the public and the media and all that jazz before the election to make sure that you have a good pulse on what you want to be advocating on and what your messaging should be. But we're past this stage, so let's just carry on. It's election time. Okay, go where the candidates are. They're busy, they're door knocking, like how can you make it as easy as possible for them to access you? So breakfasts are a really good opportunity because they're not typically on the doors that early, right? If it's a work week during the day, probably okay. because they're not hitting as many doors during that time. Look out for political events. So those are the candidate forums, those are the mix and mingle events, those are those types of opportunities. And make sure you know your elevator pitch and your key messages, because you can go up and, if you're at a forum, for instance, you can ask a question, right? So just make sure that you are aware of what the messaging is. If you have folks in your organization who have partisan leaning, so partisan leaning just means they associate with one party or another, leverage them. People can participate in election campaigns with their organization hat off, technically, but they're still aware of what you do and who you are. So they're still to have those conversations, right, in just their natural day-to-day, and that's allowed. That's okay. So just make sure that they're prepped with the messaging that you're using with everybody else. Be noisy and raise your issues. So, engage the public, engage your membership, make sure that you're using this as an education opportunity, right? This is as much about educating elected officials as it is about educating the public, because this will help hopefully influence the way they vote too, right? And so we have often suggested that some of our stakeholders have a landing page on their website that says, like, we're asking our elected officials to consider XYZ issues. We hope you consider these issues too when you're voting. And then you're not endorsing any party, you're just asking people to consider these particular social issues when you're voting. And so those are different avenues that you can look at for that. And then there's obviously the paid media and earned media. So like paid media, obviously you have to expend money to advertise. That goes into third-party advertising stuff. So just make sure that you're really, really keeping track of that and you don't cross that $1,000 threshold. Earned media, this is your op-eds, this is your media releases, like your press releases, that kind of stuff. And so, make sure you're leveraging that. If you have a good relationship with somebody in media, leverage that. Give them something to publish. Different ways to engage political parties. You can do policy submission, questionnaires, local debates. I often say, don't bother with the questionnaires. They're usually bombarded with them and they're just like copy and paste answers, right? Don't bother if you get an answer at all. So like that's just, you're probably not going to get a lot of good content from that. So I would say don't expend too much energy on that if that's the way you want to go. But going to those local debates or hosting your own event or attending events or what have you, those are the best ways to engage those things. Or a really simple way, just swing by your candidate's office. Like the candidate's office, in this case, is a 2-horse race, right? It's the UCP or the NDP. We've been telling our clients, if you are short on time and short on money, take a dozen donuts to the campaign office. Drop it off with your business card and a 1-pager of like who you are, what you do, make an introduction, say, hey, thanks for participating in the democratic process, and carry on. It takes 10 minutes and then you've made that contact and they have a way to follow up with you. Super easy, but you're making that contact. It's intentional effort. And then, participate wherever you can. Look for those opportunities or create those opportunities if those opportunities don't exist. Post-election, make sure that you're sending out your congratulatory letters, you're requesting, meetings in those congratulatory letters, send thank you letters to those folks that you met with, and then update your strategy based on what you learned during the election, based on what the platform promises say, based on who's elected, frankly, and then be patient. The onboarding process is going to take significant time this time around. We're going to see at least a 20% turnover of sitting MLAs. And regardless of who is elected, we're going to have a very different party in power this time around. And both parties are talking about restructuring the ministries again. So like, be patient, be prepared for that. When ministers are announced, make sure you're sending congratulatory letters to ministers as well. And don't try to think a little broader than just the 1 or 2 ministries that directly impact your day-to-day, right? Like a lot of our ministries tangentially impact your work, right? So I think of food insecurity, you can talk to health, you can talk to ag, you can talk to culture, you can talk to SCSS, right? And so like, think a little broader, and so you can start building that internal coalition.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I mean, it's hard to believe it'll all be over within 6 weeks or so. So I don't see any questions in the chat. So that means everyone is sifting through the information, and we're going to stop. If you have any questions, you'll have to attend maybe another forum on this. And because we did allow, I believe, an hour for this webinar. So I'll ask Liz to wrap it up now, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, actually, we do have a few questions that were just popped into the chat, but I'll wrap up, and then maybe should we just stay and answer like 1 or 2 questions after that? Or...
It's your call. You know the timing that we're dealing with.
All right, I'll wrap up in the interest of getting some folks that want to leave out on time. But really quickly, we are always interested in hearing any feedback on this webinar as well as future topics. So I will be dropping a evaluation survey in the post email, and you'll receive all the slides and other information and resources that we mentioned later. But please do fill out our survey. It really does help us serve your learning needs best. And if you do have more specific questions, maybe it relates to lobbying, maybe it relates to any other legal support that you might need for your organization, we do have services to help. We do free clinics, or you can just sit down and have a casual chat with any of our experts from Integra.org, but please do reach out to us if you do need any help. But let's address a couple of these questions here. I haven't had the chance to really read them too closely, but Yvonne, if you want to pick out any of them.
Yeah, I've read them. Yeah,
Great.
they're very specific as usual. The one about our nonprofit is exempt as a lobbying organization because you don't have business membership in Alberta. But during this election period that started on January 1st, due to a fixed date of election, we've had to stop all our paid press releases as we are flagged as issue advertising. What about event? So I don't quite understand what about event. Meaning, can you hold an event? Sorry, I don't, this is where we get into very specifics about an organization. Who stopped you from your paid press, that kind of thing. These are all too specific, I think, for us to generalize, unless you have any general comments, Aileen, about that specific question. Or if you don't understand it, just say.
Yeah, so Julie just answered that it's holding an event in person. I think it depends.
Oh, I see. I get you.
I think it depends on how you frame the event. If you're framing it as like an open house or a forum, you're not advertising anything, right? It's literally just an event. If it's a mix and mingle, like I can't think of an event that you would have unless you're holding a forum that's on a very specific topic. I can't think of an event that would be seen as advertising. But it would really just depend on how you frame it. Paid ticket, well, yeah, okay. No, if you're doing paid tickets, then that would probably be seen as advertising. If you're doing a free event and you're inviting folks from all parties or both sides of the aisle or whatever, then you'd be fine.
So you see, it depends, as many legal answers do. So I think that's that wraps up our questions and the ones that we can answer generally, and we can certainly address any others in a specific clinic, as you said. Thank you, Liz.
Sure. Okay. Yep. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. You'll hear from me via email very shortly, and thanks all for your time.